This is chapter 14, our very last chapter for the semester. This one is called Organizational Structure, Culture, and Change. So first we'll talk a little bit about organization theory and design. I liked this quote from the book. It says, "Sometimes an organization will have a structure, technology, or values that do not serve it well. The survival of the organization may rely on its ability to change to develop a more suitable structure and set of values." So organizations sometimes need change in order to survive. This one's kind of a big slide. We talk about organization theory and design. Organization design is defined as the structures of accountability and responsibility, HR practices, and business processes existing in an organization that the organization uses to implement its strategy. Basically, how is the organization designed? How should people and work be organized in order to make it more likely that the organization is going to achieve its goals? So the design is how it's organized, and organization design is wanting to design the organizations in a good way so that they'll achieve their goals. Classical organization theory is an approach to organizational design that emphasizes the importance of efficiency as the goal and utilizes hierarchy, structure, and written processes to achieve this goal. It focuses on the duties of managers and was popular back in the 1900s. So that's why I put a picture of our old friend Frederick Taylor over here. He's the father of scientific management. And if you remember from back in chapter 2, we talked about how Frederick Taylor really focused on management in the organization and the duties of the managers. And classical organization theory focuses on the duties of managers as well. However, soon after this theory came the human relations movement, well, not that soon, which was an approach to organization design in which it was assumed that workers were able to self-manage effectively and that they would flourish if allowed to do so. So this started with those Hawthorne studies we also learned about. Remember, the Hawthorne effect is when people behave differently because they're being watched, right? Employees perform differently when they're being observed. These Hawthorne studies led us to the human relations movement because we realized it's not all about management, that it's important to focus on the workers themselves. System 4 design is an organizational design consisting of 4 things: goal setting, decision-making, leadership, and reward systems. And the hope is that these 4 things would maximize trust between employees and management and facilitate two-way communication. Both the classical theory and the human relations theory assume that there's one best way of doing things, right? The classical theory focuses on management and the human relations theory focuses on the workers. But they both assume that there's one best way to do things and that we need to set a certain type of goal and do things a certain way in order to get things done the best. However, nowadays, a situational paradigm can be said to be in effect. And a situational paradigm is an approach to organizational design where the key factor is understanding the context in which the organization operates and configuring an organizational structure that meets the needs of the organization. Basically, the situational paradigm tells us that every place is different, every group is different, every organization is different. There's different goals, there's different people, there's different environments. So we need a different organization design depending on the situation, depending on where it is or who it is. So let's talk about organizational structure a little bit. There are 4 main dimensions of organizational structure. How is the organization or the workplace organized? How is it structured? Organizational structure is defined as the choices the organization makes regarding who does what, who reports to whom, how employees are grouped together, and how employees relate to each other. Organizational structure determines how information flows in the organization, how authority is distributed, and how responsibilities are assigned. right? So the organizational structure is the structure of the people who work there, right? Who's in charge of whom, how are people grouped together or departmentalized. And in fact, you can see in the little diagram or the little picture, the elements of organizational structure include departmentalization, which is splitting up into departments, right? Formalization, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's rules and regulations. Span of control, how many people are reporting to each manager. And centralization, we'll talk about that also in a moment. Let's look at these 4 things, starting with formalization. Formalization is defined as the degree to which the organization is characterized by rules and procedures, and the extent to which deviations from rules are tolerated. Organizations that are highly formalized have a lot of rules and often don't make decisions on a case-by-case basis. It may seem like a bad thing to be formalized, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it takes a lot of pressure off of people when there's codified responses to situations and you don't have to take every situation on a case-by-case basis. It can make things easier for workers to formalize things. Also creates set expectations. People know what's expected of them. There's no role ambiguity. Formalization can be a good thing or a bad thing. Another tricky concept is centralization. Centralization is the degree to which the decision-making authority is concentrated at the hands of a small number of decision makers at high levels. So you can see in the little picture on the left side, this organization is centralized. There's one manager telling everybody what to do or making all of the decisions for everybody, versus a decentralized workplace. Everybody's making the decisions together in a group. Organizations that are centralized have a small number of higher level people who make the decisions. Organizations that are decentralized allow employees of all levels to make decisions. Often these people are closer to the problem, so it's easier for them to notice it. It's usually a good thing to be decentralized. Now we'll talk about departmentalization, which, as you can see, has some more information. Departmentalization is how work is organized around departments. Back in the day, all of our organizations were organized by functional departments. Departments that combine employees working in the same function. All the marketing people work together, all the sales people work together, the accounting people together within the same department. But this is the old school method. There's an example underneath the blue and orange. You can see an example of a newer type of departmentalization where many of the departments are based on the product. So the CEO is on top, and then there are different departments: wealth management and retirement, home lending, consumer lending, community banking. Presumably this is some sort of banking or accounting firm, and they split up into 4 different departments based on the type of consumer or the type of product that they're working with. Then there's also a finance and a legal department. They probably also have an IT department and other levels of management. But the point is, we're not just splitting up by what everybody can do. They're splitting them up based on the type of consumer or type of customer or the type of product that they're working with. So organizations that use departmentalization by customer have different departments for different customer categories. Organizations that use departmentalization by product have separate departments for each product category. And organizations that use departmentalization by geography have separate departments for separate regions of the country or the world. So typically, even when they organize by customer or product category, the organization will choose to retain some functional areas, like the example on the left, such as human resources, management, IT, finance, etc. So some functional departments stay separate, like finance or IT, but it's better for the rest of the departments to be split up by who or what or where they're servicing, as opposed to exactly what they're doing, their functions. Another important part of organizational structure is the span of control. Span of control is the number of employees that report to a single manager. When employees need to be closely supervised, the span of control will be more narrow. So what's the ideal span of control? The Romans said 10. 10 people should respond to each supervisor. Napoleon said 5. And Henry Fayol, who is discussed at the beginning of this chapter in the book, I didn't mention him now, but he was involved in that first management stuff. He said 5 to 15. He was big on the managers and thought they should have the responsibility. They could have 5 to 15 employees. But the number really differs. It depends on the nature of the work and the nature of the organization. But it can certainly affect the organizational structure depending how many people report to each supervisor. All right, so those are all the different dimensions of the organizational structure that we talked about, the different things that can change in terms of structure. Now let's talk about general types of organizational structures. So we put together all those dimensions to create some types. There are organic structures, which are structures of organizations which tend to be more informal, decentralized, wide spans of control, flat hierarchies, and are departmentalized by customer, product, or geography. So this is more of the new school stuff, right? Organic structures. You can sort of think like organic is more of a new thing, so is this. Structures, these organizations are structured to be very informal and decentralized, not a lot of managers and bosses in charge and micromanaging people. 2 examples of companies that use organic structures are Google and Apple. Mechanistic structures, are structures of organizations which tend to be highly formalized, centralized, narrow spans of control, and tall hierarchies, typically organized around functional departments, more of all the old school stuff, right? Lots of management, very centralized decision-making, everything's written down and formalized, everything's divided up in the old school way of functional departments. But it is still, although it's not the norm, it's less than half, there are still a lot of companies that operate this way. And normally companies that really want to guarantee the lowest price, the rock bottom prices, are going to go with the mechanistic structures because they're more focused on getting the production out than they are about their employees being satisfied and all of that. So 2 examples of mechanistic structures that exist today are McDonald's and Walmart. A matrix structure combines the functional structure with a project-based one. So each employee in a matrix structure organization actually reports to 2 different managers, a functional manager and a project manager. So they might have, if I'm in marketing, I may have to report to the head of marketing, but if I'm working on the new website, then I'm going to report to the project manager for the website. Maybe I'm in sales and working on the new website, so I'll report to a different functional manager and the same project manager. Or maybe I'm in sales, but I'm working on getting new clients instead of a website, so I report to the sales functional manager and a different project manager, 2 managers for each person. The matrix structures typically involve dual reporting relationships with each employee reporting to 2 managers. First originated in the aerospace industry. So the aerospace industry is what started this matrix structure, but it's getting more common now. The lattice structure is characterized by person-to-person communication. There's no managers, there's no bosses, there's no authority. Employees initiate or join projects at their own choosing. You can start a project, join a project, start a team, join a team. It seems a little all over the place, but apparently it works. The key is to stick with the Dunbar number, which is 150. You want to stick with 150 or fewer employees if you're going to use the lattice structure. Gore Technologies, I believe it's called, uses the lattice structure. They make guitar strings and adhesives, I think. They talk about it in the book. And they use the lattice structure successfully, but they follow that rule. They don't hire more than 150 people per location. When they hit that number, they open up a new location. Finally, virtual organization is a company outside of a company that exists for a specific purpose. Usually this is an organization jointly established by two organizations. So sort of distance themselves from their original organizations, they create this joint venture called a virtual organization. So those are all different types of organizational structures. Now we're going to talk about organizational culture versus climate. Organizational culture is shared, taken for granted assumptions that members of an organization have and which affect the way they act, think, and perceive their environment. So again, taken for granted assumptions. Nobody told them this. It's not written in the rule book. It's just the culture of the organization, right? Maybe everybody takes turns bringing snacks into the break room. Nobody even told you this. You just kind of picked up on this. Maybe everybody wipes their feet on the mat on rainy days so the floor doesn't get all wet. This is the organizational culture. Organizational climate are the shared perceptions about a work unit's policies, practices, and what behaviors are rewarded and expected. So again, sort of what everybody thinks about their workplace, the shared perceptions about how things work. These two used to be very different, culture and climate, but they're now used interchangeably. However, one difference is that climate can be within a team or department, whereas culture is the whole organization. But they can sort of be used interchangeably. And psychological climate is the individual person's perception of the organizational climate. So this is just, remember, psychological climate is just per person. It's a person-by-person basis. Whereas the organizational culture and climate are for the whole organization. But a climate can be for just a department, whereas the culture is always the whole organization. So let's talk about dimension of culture. We're not going to call it climate anymore, but remember they can sort of be used interchangeably. I'm going to refer to it as culture for the rest of this chapter. The competing values frame book gave us some dimensions of culture, and although the competing values framework says that you can only be one of these things, we actually know that you can sort of have aspects of other ones as well. But for now, we'll just talk about the 4 different types of culture. The competing values framework proposes that these dimensions are independent of each other, like I just said, and therefore an organization that displays values of one dimension will not display values of the other dimension. However, like I just said, empirical research does not support this, and there is significant overlap across the dimensions. But let's talk about them anyway. And there are some examples of different companies that can, in the book, they give different examples of companies that fall into each of these categories. The clan culture focuses on collaboration. Words that describe clan culture are cohesive, people-oriented, team player, empowering. This is a people-focused culture for an organization. In blue, we have hierarchy culture. This focuses on controlling. Words to describe hierarchy culture include efficient, timely, consistent. Okay, again, these hierarchy cultures, it's not necessarily a bad thing because they're very efficient, but they do focus a lot on management and that big, tall hierarchy. The purple one is market, which focuses on competing. A market culture is like Walmart or McDonald's fall into the market culture. They want to be competitive. Their culture is aggressive, competitive, and customer-oriented, not worker-oriented, right? That's why it's called market. And finally, adhocracy. Adhocracy focuses on creating things. It's very creative, thinking outside the box, entrepreneurial, flexible, risk-taker, creative. Companies like Google fall into this category, thinking outside the box, focused a little more on the workers and on taking risks and being creative. Back over to the left, subcultures are a frequent occurrence within organizations with different departments and teams having different cultures, right? So again, the general organization can fall into one of these main categories, clan, hierarchy, market, or adhocracy. But within it, there can be different departments or teams that have different tendencies. Excuse me. Countercultures are identifiable units within the organization that embrace values and assumptions that directly contradict the overall organization's values. So not just a subculture that's a little bit different than the rest of the organization, but a straight up counterculture, which is opposite the rest of the organization, directly contradicts the organization's values. However, the counterculture isn't always a bad thing. It might sound like it's always a bad thing when there's a group of people or a department that's very different in terms of the general values and general culture, very different than the rest of the organization. But there's an example in the book about Ben and Jerry's, which I will let you read. I won't read it all right now. But it tells us that when Ben and Jerry's was bought by Unilever, they had very different core values, and people were worried that things would change. And in fact, they sort of did change each other a little bit. But if you read it, you'll see that counterculture can be a good thing. If you want to pause right now and read the screenshot, you can, or it's also in the textbook. So why does culture matter? Organizational culture, right? Why does the organizational culture matter? It matters for the organizational performance. Market and adhocracy cultures tend to be highly innovative. So companies that fall into those categories, the market, which is, remember, focused on the customer and being competitive, or adhocracy, which is focused on being creative and thinking outside the box, those are more innovative companies. And market cultures also have higher quality of products and services, higher profits, and higher growth. So the culture of your company does matter for your performance. It also matters for employee attitudes and behaviors. Research shows that clan culture has the strongest correlation with job satisfaction and organizational commitment, right? Which is another good thing for the organization, to not have high turnover. You want your employees to stay, so provide them with a good organizational culture. The most important aspect for employees in their organizational culture is the person-organization fit, which we talked about in a previous chapter. It's the fit between the person's values and the organizational culture's values, right? So the match between the worker and the organization's values is the most important in terms of predicting job satisfaction and organizational commitment and all of that. We want the worker to match the organization. Culture also signals what matters. Culture serves as a signal with respect to what behavior is appropriate and which behaviors would be expected from organizational members. It may even shape relationships. The culture of the organization can shape the way employees get along with each other and with their supervisors. There's more details in the book about that. Measuring culture of an organization can be very tricky. There are several established culture surveys which can be given to management and employees to measure the culture of the organization. These are used a lot in research. There's also direct observation, where researchers actually go in and spend a lot of time in the workplace and try and observe the culture themselves. When directly observing organizational culture, the most visible elements are referred to as artifacts. This is anything you can directly observe. You see the dress code, the office design, the building architecture, handbooks, even the way people talk to each other, the way that they sit, even something that an employee tells you. All of these directly observable things are called artifacts. Values are the standards of behavior or principles about what's important, what's expected. And then the assumptions are the taken for granted beliefs about human nature, right? Kind of taken for granted that you wear clothes when you go to work, right? Taken for granted that you sit on your chair, that sort of thing. All right, how is culture created in the workplace? We're almost done, I promise. There are 6 ways that culture can be created in an organization. The first is the founder's values, the person who started the organization. Their values can often remain visible for decades after the organization is first established, provided that the company is successful. History can create culture too, right? You look in a company or an organization's history and you see what worked, what didn't work, right? From the early days, whichever elements of their culture have helped them survive are the culture values they eventually retain and pass on to future generations. ASA, or attraction, selection, attrition, is a really neat kind of cycle that keeps organizational culture going. What happens is if an organization has a certain culture, it attracts those kinds of people. Let's say my organization is more of a clan-based culture. We care more about being a family and our workers and all of that stuff. Then I'm going to attract people who also like that type of organization. They're going to apply for the job. Then when I'm doing my selection procedures, I'm going to select somebody whose values match the organizational culture that I provide. So I will select them. And then finally, attrition means like going away or falling off. And what that means is that if somebody does get hired whose values don't match the organizational culture, they may end up quitting or getting fired or not working out because it's not a great match. So between these things, attracting employees whose values match, selecting employees whose values match, and keeping employees whose values match, we end up with a lot of employees whose values match. Over to the right side, newcomer onboarding. Organizations pass their cultures on to new employees, right? If there's many employees already established and just one or two new people, they might sort of fall into the culture that's already there. Leadership style. The behaviors that managers encourage, model, or punish end up determining the nature of the culture of the organization and their particular department. So the culture is shaped by how managers encourage certain behaviors, model certain behaviors, and punish undesired behaviors. On the other side is reward systems. Employees notice which employees are rewarded or recognized or promoted for certain behaviors, and then they'll copy that, right? So these are different ways that culture is created within an organization. Now we're going to talk about change. This is the last main issue. Organizational change. Research suggests that the success of a change effort is ultimately the result of how change recipients, employees who are affected by the change, receive it. So the most important part of change is how the recipients receive it. Organizational development, or OD, is a field of study that applies behavioral science principles to enact organizational change. It's a very specific field of study. We're using psychology, behavioral science, understanding how people act, to enact organizational change. When change needs to be made, it can be met with a lot of issues, and OD specialists can handle it. Human process approaches are OD interventions that have the goal of changing the human processes of the organization and increasing employee satisfaction to increase individual and organizational functioning. One human process approach is team building, which is intervention for clarifying goals and objectives of the group and roles and responsibilities of team members. Experts also use survey feedback, which is systematic gathering of information from employees to identify potential problem areas. And the opposite, which is appreciative inquiry, which identifies the unique strengths and best aspects of the organization and generates ideas about how to build on them. Technostructural approaches, on the other hand, are an intervention that involves changes in the technology or the structure of an organization, as opposed to the human processes or the employees, right? We're focusing now on the structure, the technology. This can be done with re-engineering, which is re-envisioning the organization's structure to increase coordination and efficiency. Job enrichment, where they actually change the content of jobs to increase motivation. And total quality management, which is another technostructural approach that involves an emphasis on continuous and incremental improvement in the quality of work done. So it's sort of a slow, continuous process of change. Finally, strategic change is more of a big, large-scale change effort, which targets the strategy or organizational design or even the organizational culture of an organization. It's a big change. This includes changing the structure, strategy, or culture. Big one. So those are all the different kinds of change. We can change the way the workers work, human stuff. We can change the technology and processes or the structure, or we can do a big old strategic change where we change a big component of the organization. The problem is that sometimes people resist change. As I just mentioned, the most important factor in instituting change is that the recipients are open to it. So why do change recipients resist change? There's a cognitive component where they worry that it's not going to work. They say things like, the proposed change is poorly planned. It will make us less efficient. They don't like the actual details of it. There's the affective component, right? The feelings side of it. I hate this new method. I'm so disappointed that this is what they came up with after all this work, right? Feeling frustrated, feeling upset. That's the feeling side of it. And then comes the behavioral component. I won't do it this way. I'll just do it the old way. These are ways that recipients resist change. They resist it by saying they don't like it. They resist it with their emotions. They resist it by refusing to do it. And these are some factors that can affect their reactions to it. The personal habits that they're used to, they don't want to change because of their habits. Their personality, some people's personalities are just more resistant to change. Trust in the organization and management. If the workers don't trust the organization, they don't trust them to make good changes. The personal impact of change, sometimes it can be a good thing or a bad thing, but if it personally impacts you, you're going to have an opinion on it. And if it personally impacts you in a bad way, you'll likely resist this change. And finally, features of change implementation. How is the change happening? Is it happening in a good way or a bad way? Now we'll talk about two different models of implementing change, and then we're done. The first change model is Lewin's 3-stage model of change implementation. When a change needs to be made in an organization, Lewin suggests that we go through 3 stages: unfreezing, change, and then refreezing. So first we unfreeze. This is the stage where those involved need to understand the necessity for the change and be motivated to change. You might show them, look, the other companies are all doing better than us. Or if we make this change, you'll have shorter hours. Or if we make this change, you'll have a nicer office. We're motivating the employees to want to change and showing them why it's important to change. The people involved become aware of the consequences of not changing. What's going to happen? If we don't make this change, we might have to let people go. If we don't make this change, we won't be able to get our yearly raises. We want to motivate everybody to change. Unfreeze. Get everybody willing and able and ready to change. Then comes the change. The new technology or the new structure or the new strategy is implemented during the change stage. Excuse me. And success of the change will often rely on removing roadblocks and providing support, help, and mentoring. During the change, the management shouldn't just focus on making the change. They should focus on the employees and their reactions to the change, right? Removing the roadblocks as they go. Finally, refreezing. So we unfroze, willing to make those changes. Then we changed. Now we refreeze. We want the new stuff to stick. This is the final stage where the new ways of working or organizing are made permanent. This is important because in the absence of refreezing, individuals may revert back to the old habits. We can't skip this last step. All right, the last model of change is Cotter's 8-step model of change. In this one, there's obviously more than just the 3 steps. We start by creating a sense of urgency. Why do we need to change right now? Then form a guiding coalition. You want to get people in on this. The coalition is getting more people in on your plan to change. The more people who join, the better. Power in numbers. Then develop an inspiring vision. Then convey this new vision. Then empower others to enact the vision. Then generate short-term wins. Now that the change is being made, show people that it works. Sometimes it can take years to see the positive outcome of a change. So you can do a small pilot study, something small to generate short-term small wins. Step 7 is to sustain acceleration of the vision. Keep it going. And step 8 is the permanent change. That's similar to the refreezing step of the last one. So this is just another model for instituting change in organization. And remember, the OD specialists are the people who do this. They're sort of a type of IO psychologist, and they go into organizations and help them institute change using some of these models. This might be the biggest summary slide of all. We can do it. Chapter 14, organization design are the structures of accountability and responsibility, HR practices, and business processes existing in an organization that the organization uses to implement its strategy. It's kind of long, and it's more important you understand the whole chapter than the verbose definition. Classical organization theory was the old school theory that emphasizes the importance of efficiency as the goal and utilizes hierarchy, structure, and written processes to achieve the goal. Very formalized, very manager-focused. Next came the human relations movement, which assumed workers were able to self-manage effectively. They would flourish to do so. Turns out sometimes we need managers to be in charge, sometimes we don't. Depends on the situation. The situational paradigm is the key factor in understanding the context in which the organization operates and configuring an organizational structure that meets the needs of this organization. So again, the situational paradigm is what we use now, and that really just tells us that the structure of an organization depends on the situation. The best structure depends on the situation. Elements of organizational structure include formalization, centralization, departmentalization, and span of control. Formalization is the degree to which the organization has rules and procedures. Centralization is the degree to which decision-making authority is concentrated in the hands of a small number of decision makers, right? Centralization has just a few managers instead of everybody making decisions. Functional departments are departments that combine employees working in the same function, but are not that common anymore. Most companies now departmentalize based on other things, right? Like geography or customers or products. Span of control are the number of employees that report to a single manager. Organic structures are organizations which are more informal, decentralized, wide spans of control, and flat hierarchies, and are departmentalized by customer, product, or geography. Mechanistic structures are structures of organizations which tend to be highly formalized, centralized, narrow spans of control with tall hierarchies, and are organized around functional departments. These mechanistic structures are more old-fashioned, but they are often more market-oriented and focused on the customer experience and keeping prices low, like McDonald's and Walmart. A matrix structure combines functional and project-based, meaning that each employee reports to two managers, a functional one and a project one based on their actual duty and one based on what they're working on right now. A lattice structure has person-to-person communication, no managers, no assigned authority. People start their own projects. Seems a little nuts, but it works as long as you keep those numbers under 150. A virtual organization is an organization jointly established by two other organizations to be separate with a new venture. Organizational culture is the shared, taken for granted assumptions that members of an organization have and which affect the way they act, think, and perceive their environments. Organizational climate can be used interchangeably, although it's a little different. These are the shared perceptions about a work unit's policies, practices, and what behaviors are rewarded and expected. This one is more just the work unit as opposed to the whole organization. The psychological climate is the individual person's perception of the behavioral patterns of the organization. There's 4 general types of culture, of organizational culture. There's market culture, which values being successful and the customers. Hierarchy culture emphasizes efficiency and timeliness and management. Clan culture values employee satisfaction, commitment, emphasis on fairness, employee empowerment, putting employees first, and adhocracy culture, which puts innovation and creativity first. Countercultures are identifiable units within the organization that embrace values and assumptions that directly contradict the overall organization's values, like the Ben & Jerry's and Unilever example. Artifacts are the most visible elements of the organizational culture. The values are the standards of behavior or principles about what's important, and the assumptions are taken for granted beliefs about human nature. Culture is created by the founder's values, the company's history, the attraction, selection, attrition cycle, newcomer onboarding, leadership style, and reward systems. Remember, leaders can model desired behavior, they can reward desired behavior, they can punish undesired behavior. Organization development is a field of study that applies behavioral science principles to enact change in organizations. These changes can be human process approaches, where the interventions have the goal of changing the actual human processes and increasing employee satisfaction. Technostructural approaches, which involve changes in the technology or structure of the organization to increase its effectiveness. Or strategic change, which is a large-scale effort targeting the strategy, organizational design, or organizational culture. Factors that can affect reactions to change include habits, personality, trust in the organization, personal impact, and change implementation. And the two models that we talked about of change implementation are Lewin's 3-stage model, which has unfreezing, where we understand the necessity for change and be motivated to change, then the change stage, and then refreezing, making those changes permanent. Cotter split it up a little more into 8 steps: establish a sense of urgency, form a coalition, create a vision, communicate the vision, remove obstacles, create small wins, don't quit prematurely, and anchor change in corporate culture. That is it for Chapter 14. That is it for our textbook. That is it for Psych 180. I hope these videos were helpful to you. Feel free to watch as many times as you want. I hope you had a wonderful semester. Thanks for